In the noisy, crowded brothels of Athens, a night with a woman cost no more than 2 barley loaves or a jug of cheap wine. These women, known as porni, were considered the lowest class of prostitutes, human beings reduced to mere objects of trade and pleasure. According to the speeches of famous orators like Dio and Lysias, a porni would serve 6 to 10 men a day, earning barely enough to quiet her hunger. Meanwhile, the brothel owners grew rich, with part of their profits flowing into the city's treasury as tax. In Athens, there was no age limit for entering prostitution. Historical evidence and archaeological findings reveal that girls as young as 10 to 13 years old were sold into these places. Each enslaved girl bore a permanent brand on her thigh, burned into her flesh to mark her as property for life. Life inside those houses was nothing short of torment. If a girl refused to work, she was met with brutal punishment, public beatings, days of starvation, or unspeakable torture. When a new girl arrived, a cruel ritual awaited her. She would be humiliated and assaulted in front of others, to crush her spirit and extinguish any thought of resistance. According to a man named Pappy of Thessaly, this was done deliberately to destroy their hope and identity. Spectators would stand by, laughing and mocking, turning human suffering into entertainment. New girls were considered more valuable. Men paid 10 times the usual rate for one who had not yet been touched by cruelty. Writers of that era describe such horrors casually, as if they were discussing the price of fruit in the marketplace. Privacy did not exist. Women worked in filthy corners, separated only by dirty sheets or tattered mats. Their cries of pain became background noise, a twisted soundtrack for the men waiting their turn. These stories remain buried in the dark pages of history. Yet if we wish to uncover their pain and strength, we must listen to the voices that were silenced in life. The owners of these women divided them into grotesque categories. Nubian women, unusually short women, mute women, rebellious ones, and those still considered unbroken. Each group had its own price and clientele. Art from the 5th century depicts men competing to overpower resisting women for mere amusement. Graffiti found on brothel walls shows that some men paid extra for the privilege of cutting, scarring, or crippling the women. In those brothels, violence was not just cruelty, it was commerce. In the ancient streets of Athens, the city that boasted of its art, philosophy, and democracy, there existed another world, hidden in the shadows, a world where pleasure was sold, pain was currency, and women were nothing more than property. Some women were advertised specifically for punishment. Their bodies carried split lips, broken teeth, burns from spilled oil, marks that certain men found thrilling. For these men, a woman's agony was a form of art, her screams a drunken melody echoing in dimly lit chambers. In the same city that celebrated logic and theatre, cruelty toward women became a thriving trade. But the routine brutality of daily life paled in comparison to what happened during the religious festivals. In celebrations like the Festival of Dionysia, prostituted women were handed over to groups of men for free, under the guise of a sacred ritual. Surviving accounts describe scenes of horror, drunken mobs of men assaulting women while music played, wine spilled, and bets were placed on how long the victims could endure the torture. On these days, a woman's last shred of dignity was erased. She became a plaything for the crowd, her body an offering to gods who demanded cruelty as devotion. Ancient medical records tell of women dying from internal bleeding, suffocation, or massive trauma. Priests claimed their deaths were holy, that the mingling of wine and blood on the altar would bless the land with a rich harvest. When the festivals ended, those still breathing were dragged back to the brothels to work again. The dead were thrown beyond the city walls, their bodies left to rot in ravines, discarded like refuse, forgotten by all. The so-called rituals were merely an extension of daily abuse. Women were beaten with wooden rods, leather straps, or bare fists. Regular customers were allowed to join in the punishments, inventing sadistic games for the smallest mistakes. Spilling wine, mispronouncing a name, or simply crying. For these errors, they suffered unimaginable torment. Many women were locked in pitch-black rooms, deprived of food and water for days. Others were tied to stone posts in courtyards, left shivering in soaked clothes through freezing winters, or baking under the summer sun without a drop to drink. Owners mockingly called it character correction. Anything could be used as a weapon: clubs, heavy wine cups, even the blunt edge of knives. Over time, the women learned to hide their pain behind forced smiles, because a scream or a tear only brought more violence. In a city that idolized the perfection of the human body through art and sculpture, the bodies of these women became living canvases of bruises, burns, and scars. If a woman tried to escape, the law did not see it as a plea for freedom, but as theft, stealing her owner's property. The punishment was brutal and public. Runaways were branded with hot iron on the forehead or chest, marked forever as deserters. Court records describe even worse fates. Some women were nailed to wooden boards and displayed in city squares as a warning to others. They often died from thirst or infection around the wounds. Some desperate women ran to temples, throwing themselves before the altars, begging the gods for mercy. But the priests, easily bribed, would hand them back to their owners for a small payment. Property rights outweighed divine compassion. Their blood stained the temple steps, washed away at dawn by other slaves. Each failed escape led to harsher punishment. Athenian justice had endless ways to break a woman's will while still keeping her alive enough to work. But even that usefulness meant little when the market for new women was so cheap. Ancient medical writings reveal that most of these women never lived beyond their mid-20s. Their deaths came from sexually transmitted diseases, untreated wounds, exhaustion, malnutrition, and repeated abuse. Even those covered in sores or infected injuries were forced to keep working until their bodies finally gave out. Owners refused medical care, calling it a waste of money. In the city that gave the world Plato, Socrates, and democracy, the cries of enslaved women were drowned out by laughter, their pain transformed into entertainment, and their humanity erased in the name of pleasure and profit. In ancient Athens, the price of a new girl was less than a physician's visit. If a client complained about the stench of rotting flesh or blood, the woman herself would be beaten mercilessly, as if pain could somehow perform a miracle and heal her wounds. When archaeologists excavated the ruins of ancient brothels, they discovered terrifying evidence: female skeletons whose pelvic bones were shattered from forced intercourse and relentless labor, skulls cracked by blunt strikes, ribs broken and improperly healed, and spines twisted and deformed, as though years of torment had sculpted their suffering into bone. These remains stand as silent witnesses to a system of organized cruelty. When a woman grew too weak or ill to earn, she was thrown beyond the city walls, without a funeral, without a name whether she was alive or not. This was the same Athens that taught the world about beauty, balance, and harmony, yet here, the bodies of women were discarded like shattered pottery. Pregnancy was not seen as a natural event, but as damage to valuable property. The punishment was immediate and brutal. To prevent conception, women were forced to drink poisonous brews, beaten in the abdomen, or made to lift impossibly heavy loads until their bodies miscarried. Ancient medical texts describe horrific abortion practices, poisonous herbs that caused violent convulsions, boiling oil poured into the womb, or sharpened wooden sticks forced inside. If the pregnancy could not be stopped, the birth took place on the same filthy straw mat where men came to satisfy their lust. There were no midwives, no medicines, no sanitation. Most women bled to death or died of fever soon after giving birth. Archaeologists have found tiny infant bones in the drainage channels and refuse pits behind these ancient brothels, newborns discarded like waste. The killing of infants was routine, especially girls or children born to slaves. For many mothers, it was not murder, but mercy, a desperate act to spare their children from the same hell they themselves endured. Under Athenian law, these women had no human status. Their bodies, their labor, their very existence belonged entirely to their owners. They were forced to work under invented debts, for food, clothing, and shelter debts that grew daily with interest and fabricated fines. If a woman dared to refuse a violent or dangerous client, she was severely punished. Consent did not exist. Court records reveal that some women tried to seek justice, but the law was always against them. A slave woman's testimony against a free man was only admissible if she was first tortured to verify her truth. This was the same society that prided itself on inventing democracy, yet half its population, its women, were excluded entirely from it. And among them, enslaved women stood at the bottom, considered worth less than livestock, for at least animals were fed and sheltered regularly. Still, on rare occasions, a faint glimmer of hope appeared. A wealthy patron's favor, or a master's greed for higher profit, might lead a woman to be trained as a dancer or musician to serve at elite gatherings instead of the brothel floor. A few women found such fortune. If one became the mistress of a rich patron, she might be given her own room adorned with silks, perfumes, jewelry, and luxury. But even this was no freedom. It was a gilded cage. Its walls were not made of iron, but of comfort, beauty, and illusion, concealing the same chains of slavery beneath a veneer of grace. In the heart of ancient Athens, behind marble temples and echoing theatres, lived women whose names history never cared to record. They were called favorites, beloveds, or companions, but they knew the truth: their worth was fragile, fleeting, and wholly dependent on the shifting desires of men who owned them. Their lives hung by a thread woven from whim and power. One wrong glance, one delayed response, one breath of defiance, and the same man who once adorned them with jewels could in the next moment send them back to the crowded brothels or order their death without hesitation. Historical accounts reveal that these so-called favorites were not symbols of affection, but of ownership. They were often used as gifts of hospitality, offered to guests as if their bodies were fine wine or silk enjoyed briefly, then returned without consequence. The transaction was casual, the cruelty deliberate. Even at the highest rung of this twisted hierarchy, a woman was nothing more than property, her beauty a commodity, her youth an investment, her obedience a form of currency. The golden chains that adorned their necks were no different from the iron shackles that once bound their ankles. And when youth faded, when time carved its traces upon their faces, the illusion of value dissolved. Whether she had been a street slave or a cherished mistress, her fate ended the same way: a nameless death, followed by erasure. There were no funerals for these women, no mourning processions, no prayers whispered in their memory. Their bodies were dragged beyond the city walls, discarded in ravines and shallow, unmarked graves. Against sacred Greek custom, they were denied burial stones, inscriptions, or offerings. The act itself was a statement. These women did not deserve remembrance. They were meant to vanish body, name, and soul. Even for the rare few who managed to purchase their freedom, there was no redemption. Freedom for them was a hollow word. Society branded them forever as impure, unworthy of respect. They could walk among free citizens but never belong. They became living ghosts, moving through the city unseen present, yet erased, as though they had never existed at all. Archaeologists, centuries later, unearthed the proof of their forgotten existence. Among heaps of broken pottery and household refuse, they discovered female remains, bones scattered carelessly, buried beside shards of clay and fragments of utensils. No names, no markings, no honor. In a civilization that immortalized its kings, generals, and poets in marble, the women who built the foundation of that same society were left to rot in silence. Their suffering was too common, too inconvenient to deserve poetry. But Athens's cruelty did not stop at forgetting it evolved into entertainment. The pain of women became a source of laughter, their humiliation a public spectacle. In the crowded theatres, playwrights like Aristophanes mocked prostitutes as crude and lustful, portraying them as creatures worthy only of ridicule. Men cheered and laughed as actors mimicked scenes of rape, beatings, and degradation. The suffering of real women was transformed into a comedy for the masses. Inside homes, the same violence was painted onto pottery and wine cups. Beautifully, detailed illustrations showed acts of assault and dominance, displayed proudly at feasts and gatherings. The brutality had become so ordinary, so woven into the fabric of daily life, that it was no longer recognized as cruelty, it was simply culture. Poets sometimes celebrated the refinement of high-class courtesans, the educated entertainers of the elite, but the women from common brothels were written only as objects of mockery. Their cries were turned into rhymes. Their tears became metaphors for rain or morning dew. In a society that revered tragic theatre as the height of art, the real tragedies endured by living women were rewritten as jokes. Athens had mastered the art of turning away from pain. It had learned to profit from silence. Brothels paid steady taxes to the state treasury, and the trade of women's bodies became one of the city's most profitable industries. Democracy flourished, built upon the suffering of those who had no voice within it. While Socrates debated the nature of virtue in the public square, just a few streets away, hundreds of women were being bought and sold like cattle. While Pericles delivered his eloquent speeches about Athens' noble spirit, the city grew rich through organized human trafficking. The grandeur of its temples, the marble columns of the Parthenon, and the magnificent stages of its theatres all were financed, in part, by the blood and bodies of enslaved women. The glory of Athens, celebrated for centuries, was not built solely on philosophy, art, or democracy, but also on exploitation. Behind every white marble statue of a god or hero, there was a woman whose name had been stripped away, whose suffering made that civilization possible. And yet, in modern textbooks, in tourist brochures and museum exhibits, this truth is sanitized or erased. We are shown the brilliance of Greek architecture, the poetry of Homer, the wisdom of Plato, but not the women who were crushed beneath that legacy. To tell their story would be to tarnish the myth of perfection. But their absence is not silence. In the ruins of Athens, they still linger in the unmarked graves, in the shattered pottery etched with their images, in the faint graffiti left on brothel walls 2,000 years ago. Their presence endures, not in statues or epics, but in whispers, carried by the wind that moves through those broken stones. Their story deserves to be heard, because the measure of any civilization is not in its temples or its heroes, but in how it treated those who could not defend themselves. And Athens, the cradle of democracy, was also a cradle of silence, built upon the suffering of women it chose to forget. So today, when we walk among its ruins, when we gaze at the marble that gleams under the sun, we must remember what that light hides: the shadows of the enslaved, the voices that were buried, and the truth that still waits to be spoken.